The first major event in the context of education, as we talked about, was the emergence of the grammar translation method in the 19th century in Germany. Now, this method, you have to remember, came about at a time when learning was based on the study of classics. And the method people used to teach was a very classical method. Memorization, learning texts, focus on grammar, focusing on memorization of vocabulary. And the setting, as we mentioned in the grammar setting, was one where people weren't taught so much as they were trained. And they were trained through rote learning. So this is the environment that when you went to school as a child, and your parents sent you to school, or you were a teacher, this is what school was to you. Okay, so there wasn't any other way. This is the way we learned. But during the 18th century, more people needed to be educated. And so the grammar translation method developed as a way of educating people about their own language and foreign language. But the methods that were applied were methods that were very similar to the way that Latin was taught in the grammar schools. So it was developed in Germany during the 19th century for teaching language to secondary school students. It attempted to adapt classical language learning to the modern school setting, while maintaining the traditional focus on grammar and translation, right? And these which were familiar to both teachers and students. Here's a summary of this method. The goal of foreign language study is to learn a language in order to read its literature, or in order to benefit from the mental discipline and intellectual development that result from foreign language study. As you can see, there's nothing in there about speaking. There's nothing in there about using it to communicate, okay? Reading and writing are the major focus. Vocabulary selection is based solely on the reading text used, and the words are taught through bilingual word lists, dictionary study, and memorization. The sentence is the basic unit of teaching and language practice. Accuracy is emphasized. Grammar is taught deductively. Again, the rule, introduce the rule, practice the rule, and apply the rule in controlled settings. The student's native language is the medium of instruction. Now, something else was happening in the 1850s, which I'll mention now, and that was that you had something called the Cambridge and Oxford local examinations. And these examinations were put into place because with the grammar translation method, which was introduced in order to teach people foreign languages, in order to teach them their own language, you had the need for these students to enter university, to graduate from high school, from secondary school, and enter university. So they had to test them to see how well they had learned. And in England, this was put to Oxford and Cambridge, the largest universities, the dominant universities. And they came up with an exam. And the exam, as you might imagine, was very similar to the way that they looked at the world, which was Latin. And in this way, they constrained the method, because the exams themselves weren't necessarily focused on communication. In fact, they weren't focused on communication at all. They were very classical. And so the grammar translation method was very much limited by these examinations and by the world in which it was used. Okay, so it was a revolutionary concept, but it doesn't look to us very revolutionary, but it was at the time. But in fact, it wasn't really able to take off. It wasn't really able to change the way that teaching took place, even though there were some developments in teaching within the method. The method itself was constrained by the climate at the time. Other problems with this method is there's no theory of language learning underlying grammar translation. There's no attempt to describe why people learn, how they learn, or how best to teach them. So what was the justification for teaching languages in this way, either from the point of view of linguistics or pedagogy? There was none. Remember, the justification was that this is the way that you go to school and learn. The lack of scientific theoretical underpinning is what separates this method from what follows. So, as I mentioned, the method itself was constrained, but there was another movement that came along. And with this movement, you find that people start to ask, what is the best way to teach? What is the best way to learn? Prior to the Reform movement, you have the pre-Reform movement. In the 19th century, there were several, well, they weren't all scholars, they were teachers. And there were people, for example, Francois Guan, the last name there, he was a teacher of Latin, and he wanted to learn German. And he applied the same way that he had learned Latin, the same way he taught Latin, to learning German. It didn't work. He didn't learn anything. And he became frustrated and realized that this is not the right way to teach, nor is it the right way to learn. Now, I won't talk in detail about these people. Several names will come up in the presentation, and they're there as reference for you if you want to learn more, and just to set the context a bit with the time period and the major names. Now, these people were passionate, they were informed, and they really thought that we were doing a disservice to our students, to the children, by trying to teach them in the old way, that they weren't learning. So they were looking for a way to increase learning. The characteristics of this movement were the recognition of a possible connection between first language and second language learning, L1 and L2. A focus on meaning, not just form. Okay, in the study of Latin, we mentioned before, you had a text, and you memorized words with that text, also grammar translation. You had a word list in order to read a text. There's no emphasis on creating meaning, or especially creating new meaning. It was simply to understand the text. Now, the form was very important, obviously. You had to know the rules, you had to be able to conjugate verbs, etc. But meaning wasn't considered so important. So the focus shifted from form to meaning. Language was put in context, and the skills were separated. So for the first time, people asked, is it possible to separate the four skills of language and teach them separately? Reading, writing, speaking, and listening. This was followed by the reform movement itself. And the major figures of this movement, I've listed here. And the difference, what separated the reform movement from the pre-reform movement and other movements that came prior to this, was there was, again, a realization that that language teaching had to have some scientific foundation, that there needed to be some way of understanding how to teach language and how language is learned. So this is, again, something new, because people didn't really pay attention to the way it was taught or the way we would learn. They paid attention to how school works, if you will. Not trying to describe why it works that way or how it should indeed work. Now, the last name on the list was Henry Sweet, and this is a picture of Henry Sweet. He was an Englishman who developed something you're probably familiar with, which is the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA. Now, why is this important? Well, for now, first of all, it's focused on spoken language, on being able to pronounce, not on reading and writing. Again, with Latin, no one really knows how to pronounce Latin. There are no Romans left to teach us how to pronounce it correctly. We just read it the way we read it. There are no rules, and there's no need, because it's not a language for speaking, it's a language for accessing text. It was a mental discipline, remember, and it was a way to be trained classically. Now, the IPA was the central element, phonetics was a central element of a new field called applied linguistics. And applied linguistics is simply the application of linguistics to language teaching and learning. Very important for us as language teachers. The major beliefs of the reform movement were that spoken language is primary, and this should be reflected in an oral-based methodology. Quite a shift. No longer are we looking at reading and writing, now we're looking at something that is based on speaking and listening. The findings of phonetics should be applied to teaching and to teacher training. Again, now science is being applied to the practice of teaching. Learners should hear the language first, before seeing it in written form. So, again, focusing on the oral aspects of language rather than the written ones. Words should be presented in sentences, and these sentences should be practiced in meaningful contexts and not in isolated, disconnected elements. The rules of grammar should be taught only after students have practiced grammar points in context. That is, grammar should be taught inductively. So now we're seeing the shift to inductive learning from deductive learning. Translation should be avoided, although the native language could be used in order to explain new words or to check comprehension. Probably this sounds familiar to you. I think this is probably the way many of you perhaps teach, and the way that you learned. There was a need to not translate, but of course translation was a useful tool. But it's a useful tool for learning meaning, not for learning rules, etc. Now, the basic principles of the reform movement were again the primacy of speech, and with it, the founding of the IPA system for transcription of text. Connected text, the basis of learning materials, fewer isolated sentences and wordless. Okay? So you put language in sentences and not just in isolated elements. An oral classroom methodology was an absolute priority. Okay. Now, this was a scientific basis for teaching, and it's one obviously that they gained quite a hold because, as you can see, it's very similar to what we do now. But there was another approach too that turned to be very popular, and that's the one